continued on looking at this second main theme of John, which is Moses and the law. And we were in chapter 8, so we were looking at the woman caught in adultery and how Jesus was put in the position of a judge there, which he accepted. And he judged not according to the letter of the law, but through the spirit of mercy. And we talked a little bit about the whole issue with that passage not always appearing in John in ancient manuscripts. It kind of jumped around, and in some manuscripts it's missing. But the church fathers decided that's where it belonged, and that's what our Bibles look like. And they chose well, and because chapter 8 and chapter 9 really go together here in John. So we'll be looking at that. So who would like to do the drive-by readings for chapter 9? Connor? Sure. Okay, thanks. So, just off the top of your head, what happens in chapter 9? What is the event in chapter 9? Yes, the man born blind. Correct. And typically, as is John's typical way, he follows that event with teaching based on that event. And his teaching then is the theme of the chapter, which is, again, answer the question, why did the Logos come? He came to open the eyes of the spiritually blind. And that's fairly clear just in the first few verses. So, Connor, if you could read verses 4 through 7, that'll give us a foundation.
All right, so verse 4 and 5 is Christ talking. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing.
So it's a very kind of brief narrative of the events, but Jesus manages to put a little teaching about light. Seeing and light, if he is the light of the world, means more than just making somebody able to physically see. And so this is what John pursues in the rest of this chapter. Now, we all are spiritually blind. We all are all under the curse of chapter 3, verse 18. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So we're all born into unbelief. We are born into condemnation until that point that we first believe. So, and that is spiritual blindness. So he heals the man born blind, and that leads us to verse 39. Connor.
What verse?
39.
Go through 9.
39.
Oh, 30.
Yeah.
Wow, it's one chapter. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind."
So he says flat out why he came into the world. And it's about seeing spiritually and spiritual blindness. And we'll get into this verse more as we come to a close here. So he makes some to see spiritually, but he veils the eyes of others. He veils the eyes of the self-righteous. And this is an act of grace. Caleb. this is why I say that this chapter is really paired up with chapter 8, because the act of mercy toward the adulterous woman is followed by an act of grace toward the man born blind. And this is how God deals with us. And we see that in Exodus 33:19. God is talking to Moses, and this is when he is about to let him see his back. And he says, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. So he makes a separation. God makes a separation between grace and mercy. So it is right that we do as well. So what is the difference between mercy and grace?
Grace is a gift. Mercy is the pulling away of a deserved punishment.
That's very close.
The Lutheran preacher taught me that.
Yeah. No, that's not wrong. I would put it this way, though, and this is how I believe Dennis has put it over the years.
Who?
Dennis, used to preacher.
I was trying to think of an old church father.
Oh, no, yeah.
From the 200s.
Dennis of Mopsoestia.
I didn't hear the D in Dennis.
Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. Grace is getting what you do not deserve. So, I mean, it's basically the same thing as what the Lutheran preacher said. You know,
The way I was
mercy is removing a punishment.
Yeah.
Grace is giving a gift.
Yeah.
So
The way
it's
I
essentially
was
the same thing.
expressing it was a volition, literally given the gift
Yeah.
from God. Literally, God taking away the punishment.
Yeah, so it's essentially the same thing. And so, in these two chapters, Christ is demonstrating the words that he spoke to Moses, which, of course, goes along with the theme for this part of the gospel. You know, Moses and the law. So, from that point, we can begin with verse 2.
And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?
Okay, so they see a man born blind, and their immediate reaction is, this is a punishment for sin. But who sinned? And this is according to the law. And indeed, we are all born into that fatal handicap of 3:18, that handicap of unbelief. But that doesn't mean that's why people are born with handicaps, with physical handicaps. So, in the healing that Connor's already read about, the man's eyes were born again. The man's eyes, by Christ's words, he receives mercy. No one sinned. And then in the healing, in the gift of sight, he receives grace. So that's the physical analogy. But it's about opening the eyes of the man spiritually as well. And throughout his story, he demonstrates a growing revelation about Jesus, the person of Jesus, and who he is. And we can see this. This is going to be a handful of verses, just single verses. Verse 11.
Verse
11.
11. He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight.
And then 17.
So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? He said, he's a prophet.
And 33.
If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
And then 38.
He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him.
So this blind man He goes from Jesus the man to the prophet to being from God to being God. This is and this is all within a very short amount of time. But his eyes are open, certainly, but his spiritual eyes are wide open by the end of it. And he also gets there through the perseverance of his faith. Verse 22.
His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue.
Okay, so this is about his parents, but certainly he was under the same pressure. So he's under the pressure of being thrown out of the synagogue. And then verse 34.
They answered him, "You were born in utter sin. Would you teach us?" And they cast him out.
And they cast him out. And they also appointed to him the guilt, the sin guilt that Christ had already announced was not really there. But he persevered. His declaration of verse 38, when he worshiped Christ, comes after verse 34. So he persevered in his faith. So any thoughts or conversation about that? Any of that?
Well, it's just stark. They quote unquote know so much, but they know so little.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the theme of the rest of the chapter.
Yeah, like Jesus at the end, telling them when they say, "Are we blind also?"
Mm-hmm.
He says, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see." They think they know. Therefore, your sin remains.
Kind of really puts a magnifying glass into reality that knowledge really isn't worth that much.
Mm-mm.
You know, all the knowledge in the world, on the internet and everything. I saw some quote this week, and I don't remember, possibly I saw it on one of y'all's sites, I don't know, but I saw this quote that said the world has got more knowledge than it's ever had, but less wisdom than it's ever had in history or something like that. I don't remember where I saw that, but anyway, it kind of struck me, you know. So that reality.
Yeah, and just to look back for a little bit, that was the conversation with Nicodemus.
Yeah.
When Nicodemus was relying on knowledge, and even Jesus' knowledge, but Jesus' answer was that doesn't have anything to do with it. You must be born again.
Sure.
Prophecy of the end times, I can't remember what Jeremiah or something that said that in the end times knowledge shall increase. So
Yeah.
we've seen that in spades.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So I'm expecting Jesus any day, really. He can come back anytime. I wouldn't stop it.
No. Anything else?
This is almost like, this isn't a fully formed thought, but this is almost like a repeat of the Garden of Eden story. Eyes being opened and then getting exiled from the holy place. But it's the false teachers who are doing the exiling, not God. It's almost like an inverse.
Yeah.
You know, Christ is doing the eye opening. This is the good version.
Right.
But then the teachers of the law can't handle it, so they exile him out. It's like an inverse of Genesis 3.
Yeah, and this is what he does. If you consider that the tree of life was the cross, or a precursor of the cross, then it's only people whose eyes are opened spiritually, by the Holy Spirit that can see it.
The other thing that I find remarkable is the use of mud, and spit.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing because if you think about it, we have this treasure in jars of clay.
Right.
Clay is basically water and mud. So it's like a healing of the jar of clay.
Yeah.
Here, so it can hold.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that in just a minute here.
I won't take your thunder.
But before we do that, the bottom line here is the message here is verse 32.
Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind.
Right. Nothing from Moses in the books of the law, all the way back to Genesis 1, is like this. Opening the eyes of one born blind. So, now, if you could read verse 16.
Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was division among them.
So it takes the question of verse 2, who is the sinner here, and directs it at Jesus. But the answer is the same. The answer is still verse 3. This is not about sin, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Any closing ideas about that? I wanted to bring that out from verse 32. Again, this is another connection to Moses and the law, and we're about to get into that a little bit more. But before we do, are there any closing thoughts?
An observation, it says, "And there was a division among them." And I remember, I think in Acts, there's a verse that talks about, I think many or at least some of the temple, after Jesus' ascension, became believers. I'm trying to remember where. Do you remember that?
You may be thinking of the verse where it says, and not a small number of the priests.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
Convert. Yeah.
Yeah, and so my mind goes to that, saying that, and there was division amongst them.
Yeah. I'm sure there was a lot of throwing out of the synagogue.
Yeah, and my mind keeps going to this of being kind of a form of groupthink. These Pharisees and Sadducees, where they just seem to be real concerned about what each other thinks of each other rather than
right.
the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
In this century, being thrown out of the synagogue was probably a really good thing.
Well, it's not a bad thing.
Badge of honor.
Yeah. There's also that moment in Acts where Paul realizes that the crowd is a mix of Sadducees and Pharisees, and he pits them against each other by declaring the resurrection.
He is a cunning fellow.
There's a lot of politics going on. All right, Connor, can you read verse 6 again?
Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud.
Okay, this is what David was referring to a minute ago. This is another continuation from chapter 8, when Jesus was working his finger in the dirt. Here he is again, working with the stuff of creation. And it replays the creation of Adam before the fall, as Connor was talking about before. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody who was born blind, but that usually means their eyes are not formed, and sometimes it's just empty sockets. So this was a creative miracle. He was creating eyeballs in the man, and he used his spit and dirt. This is God creating something out of the dirt, just like the creation story. And again, the man didn't just receive his sight; he received spiritual sight. So this is another illustration of the spirit regeneration, of Jesus' followers. It's only He can make them see spiritually, and this is a new creation. So he uses this event, in his teaching to apply the miracle of healing physical sight to healing of spiritual sight. And this is another one of those events that's going to be referred to again in later chapters. So it really stuck with them. So any continuing thoughts about any of that?
Just like Adam, when God creates Adam, he breathes into him life. So
Yeah.
he makes him out of dirt, or maybe he's made out of dirt. He breathes in. So it's things that come from the mouth of God.
Right.
And so here's the same thing. In some ways, from the mouth of God comes his spit into the dirt,
Yeah.
creating blood.
Right.
Comes a healing salve to create.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, man,
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It's amazing. But it's I don't know what it says about understanding the mouth of God.
Mhm.
What's in the mouth of God?
Well,
What's in His breath. So.
if someone were to spit in your face, what would your reaction be?
So you're fighting it.
Yeah. And if somebody breathed in your face, they're basically, I mean, you brought this up before in past days and years. Your breath is exhaust, but the exhaust of God is life-giving. His spit in your face is sight-giving. These things that we would consider insults or just, vile violations of your personal space. These things are like blessings from God. If they're from God, anything from God is going to be a blessing.
Just think if He did this during COVID times.
Yeah, cough in your face. Well, that's life-giving. So, I mean, that's something you can say about the mouth of God, that only beautiful, great and wonderful blessings come from it.
Because I think, when we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide,
Yeah.
which is poison, basically. When God breathes out, He breathes out oxygen.
Yes, it's life itself. All right, well, let's jump a little bit further down. And Connor, if you could read 22 through 20. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just had a weird question come to me. I was going to see if you have any thoughts on it. I never thought on this before, but we're talking about man made from dust. So a lot of the things in Genesis are made by what they call creation ex nihilo, meaning from nothing.
Out of nothing.
But man's not a creation ex nihilo. He's made from dirt.
Yeah.
From sand. So what do we make of that? Is there any significance of that? I don't know the answer. It's just-
Well, everything after the separation of the land from the water, everything was made from that material, as far as I know,
Okay.
except for Eve. I mean, indirectly she was made from it, but directly she was the only thing that was not made from dirt.
Yeah,
On the day of the creation of vegetation, that comes up out of the dirt.
that's true.
So, I mean, that's just
When-
God's,
when
like,
he's
it's
creating-
God's material.
When he's creating the birds and the fish and that, I guess that's. I had to just read that again.
I think the church just kind of accepts that they were made of the soil as was Adam, but I mean, it doesn't say specifically.
Yeah. All right.
Made out of the materials that are created when you separate light from dark.
Yeah, when you start the separation. Do you have anything on that, Nick?
My initial thought, and this is obviously without any study, and I've had this thought for a long time, but we always use this phrase in church that this is not our home. But I almost think that's wrong, because we are made for the earth. We're made from the earth, right? So, and we even read this in Revelation, that the dwelling place of God is with man, meaning God dwells with us while we dwell with Him. So while earth will be regenerated, recreated, whatever you want to call it, we were made for the earth. And so that's just because we're made from the earth, and that's my initial thought without doing any kind of actual study into it.
Oh.
But somebody might have a better thought on that.
Connor has a
than I
thought.
have.
I do.
You nodded your head when I said you loved it.
Well, we're not just made from dirt. We're made from dirt and the spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Big difference.
Yeah, there's a difference there. We are, I mean, as the priesthood, as the indwelling of God, we are the meeting point between heaven and earth, right? The spirit and the dirt in one form. So there's
Yeah.
something there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Well,
gonna say.
one of the declarations of John is that Jesus is life.
Yeah.
So there is something of Jesus or something of God in every living thing, including the carrot. So there's also that.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're a body, soul, and spirit. And in my opinion, the best part of every person is immaterial. Is immaterial.
You know, in Genesis it says, "Let us make man in our image," the Trinity, in creation. So we have body, soul, and spirit. And also in Isaiah it says God created the earth to be inhabited, not Mars and not Jupiter and the moon. He said He created earth to be inhabited, which He placed us there. But we're made in the image of God. But yet in the Psalms it says, "Lord, Thou knowest our framework, that we're but dust." But He's preparing us for the new heaven and new Jerusalem to worship Him for eternity in a resurrected body. Somehow that has a relation. I don't know
Yeah. Well,
how just that works exactly.
that's a good overview, though.
Yeah. What the Bible says.
Yes, indeed. Well, no, that didn't answer anything. But let's plow ahead. Connor, if you could read verses 22 through 29.
His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from."
Okay, so keeping with the theme, John again records an invocation of Moses. And it's the Jewish officials' pride that they belong to Moses, but they don't have any idea about Jesus.
This is what Moses is doing in his grave.
Yes, spinning around. I don't know if we're going to read this verse or not, but this healing, it's kind of just thrown a line thrown in. But this healing was on the Sabbath. They don't make a big deal of it here, but I'm sure that had or John doesn't make it a big deal, but I'm sure that was part of the mix. But they used the law to terrorize the parents of the man, and even though they had nothing to do with anything except that they have been exonerated from sin, because the man is not blind anymore. Just as Jesus said, they did not sin. So that's their only part in it. But the question of who is the sinner here arises, and of course, in the Jewish officials' view, Jesus is a sinner, even though he's pulled off this thing that no one has ever seen before. So the assumption of verse 24, we know this man is a sinner, is the same as the assumption of verse 2, who sinned here, the man or the parents. And it's just a focus on, it just portrays a focus on these people are just always trying to find somebody who's guilty. Who can we judge to show how devoted we are to the law? So there's that. But again, the invocation of Moses. So any thoughts?
Question, real quick, because, we know in scriptures it was Jesus' habit to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're at a point where any connection with Jesus was thrown out of the synagogue.
Right.
I just wondered what at this point, if anybody knows, maybe did Jesus stop going to the synagogues, or is he still going? And what do they do with Jesus when he comes in? You know, so.
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose they don't do anything to him that he doesn't want them to do.
That's exactly right. So, it would be interesting to know a little bit about that. So.
Yeah.
That was the main synagogue, right?
But
That was the big main synagogue. Is he in Jerusalem here? Doesn't matter. Okay.
Well, from the end of chapter 8, it looks like he has just left the temple. They were going to stone him, and he says he hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. So, yeah, he's probably in the area of the temple still.
Siloam was close to Jerusalem.
Okay, Connor, if you could read verses 39 through 41.
Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains."
Okay, so this is certainly kind of a mysterious little conversation of what Christ means exactly. The church typically interprets it as concerning seeing or understanding the law, which the Pharisees claim they could do. Now, there's also kind of a question of what was the nature of the question. What about us? Are we blind also? You know, was it sincere? Was it antagonistic? Oh yeah, are you saying that we're blind too? Could be sarcastic. Yeah, right. Yeah, we're blind, sure. You know, we have to kind of decide for ourselves what we think the nature of the question was, because it kind of, will lead to what the nature of the answer is.
It's almost like how dare you is basically for me.
Yeah.
Do you think they were interpreting the word blind, as Pharisees, as being physically blind? Or do you think they were picking up on the spiritual meaning behind it?
Well, I think they must be picking up on the spiritual here a little bit.
Okay.
Because obviously they're not physically blind.
Yeah.
So I've always taken it as a sincere question, but that's anybody's guess, really.
I don't think they were ever sincere when you get down to it.
Well, yeah, you can never really trust them. They warned Jesus that Herod wanted to kill him, when actually Herod wanted to see him, to see if he couldn't get a miracle out of him. They just can't really be trusted.
It's interesting in the theater when you're trying to design a motivation for a character. I always say 9 times out of 10, if you think of the most self-centered reason for doing something that you can, then you're probably right.
Yeah, exactly. I think that if it was a sincere question, then they probably should not have needed to ask it. If they have some doubts about whether they're blind or not, then that should be their answer. Yes, you are. But the question is still pertinent because it's not only applicable to the Pharisees; it's applicable to the entire nation of Israel. Certainly there was a multitude of people at that time that were blind. So the event begins with a question: who is the sinner here, this man or his parents? And it ends with a question: are we blind too? And Jesus gives a clear answer. The Pharisees claim to see what is good, the law, in order to apply guilt, but they are blind to the better thing, mercy and grace. So that's how God will deal with them. If you're going to be administrators of the law to the goal of judgment, then that's what you will reap. And if it is to the goal of mercy and grace, then that is what you will reap. But this all can go back to chapter 5, verse 45. Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. So we can, every time we see this arrogant connection that they make to Moses, we can go back to that verse and see what Christ says about that. So that is the end of this chapter. We don't have time to go on, so I'll just close out by saying this is the sixth sign, the man born blind. And these signs are getting just more and more incredible. This one, nobody has seen it since the beginning of time. But the next one is going to be even more so. Yeah. So, any closing thoughts today before we
It's
we disassemble?
interesting to me, because especially if you've read it, a lot of the Greek tragedies, there's always the blind prophet, his name is
Yeah.
Theseus.
Yeah.
He's blind, but that gives him insightful sight in other ways.
Yeah, that's-
And he takes Oedipus, who can see, but he's blind,
Uh-huh.
and then ultimately he blinds himself, and then that's when he's able to see more clearly.
Yeah, that's a trope in movies. The Village comes to mind. The blind girl in the village sees more than everyone else in the town. So I think it's called The Village, that M. Night Shyamalan story. All right. Well, is that any closing thoughts, Connor?
I'm running this thing through Genesis 3 this whole time. I've been sort of comparing it to the fall story. And this last quote from Jesus at the end: if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. He's sort of comparing them to Adam and Eve, I think.
Well, the knowledge of the good and evil.
They're saying, are we blind? He kind of inverts it almost. They are spiritually blind, but if they were truly blind, they would have no guilt. It's an enigmatic thing that he's saying, and I think it really only makes sense if you.
It is very enigmatic.
If you run it through Genesis 3, I think that's really the only way that it kind of makes sense. I can't really think of other way to understand what he's saying.
It seems reminiscent of Romans 7, where if it were not for the law, I wouldn't know what sin was.
Yeah.
What is it? Sin through the law.
Right. Sin is, the law reveals sin. It doesn't absolve you of it. So yeah, those are both good thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming and sitting through it. We'll pick up at chapter 10.